close your eyes and imagine the deepest, softest velvet of the universe, where even the silence is a kind of music. This is where our story begins, long before the sun was born, and long, long before your great-great-grandparents saw the light. Our story belongs to a tiny, gentle spark named Lumen. Lumen wasn't a star yet. She was just a notion, a possibility, a wisp of hydrogen and helium gas suspended within a colossal, whispering entity called the Great Nebula of Somnus. Somnus was the cosmic cradle, a cloud of dust and gas so vast it stretched across 1,000 light years, a billowing, beautiful curtain of purple, indigo, and silver cosmic threads. In this deep, dark quiet, millions of these gaseous wisps drifted, each one dreaming of becoming a star. But to become a star, one must first learn to listen to the oldest song in the universe, the song of gravity. Gravity, the grand conductor of the cosmos, doesn't shout. It doesn't sing loudly. It hums. It is the faintest, most patient whisper, calling all matter to come closer, to hold hands, to embrace. Lumen began to feel this gentle pull. At first, it was like a slight chill, a barely noticeable pressure. She was spread out thin, feeling lonely in the vastness. But then, one by one, the atoms of hydrogen surrounding her heard the same quiet hum, and they slowly, reluctantly, began to drift inward towards Lumen's core. "Come closer," whispered the hum of gravity. "You are meant to be together." This gathering was not fast. It took tens of thousands of years. But time means nothing in the nebula of Somnus. As more and more hydrogen atoms joined Lumen, they didn't just become part of her, they became closer, and closer, and closer still. The sheer weight of the gathering cloud, Lumen's cloud, began to create pressure. This pressure, in turn, created heat. Lumen was transforming. She was no longer a cold wisp of gas. She was now a vast, swirling, warm protostar. She didn't glow yet, she just simmered. Her center was a deep, fiery red, hidden beneath layers of dark, swirling gas. It was the color of a heart beating beneath a dark cloak. She felt dizzy from the spin. As the cloud shrank, like an ice skater pulling in their arms, Lumen began to rotate faster and faster. Around her equator, the leftover dust and gas flattened into a vast, dark, rotating disk, Lumen's nursery, where one day, if she lived long enough, planets might form. But that was a story for another night. For now, Lumen was focused on the pressure building in her core. The temperature was rising beyond imagination. 10 million degrees, then 12, then 14. It was an unbearable heat, but it was also the heat of ultimate potential. Lumen knew what was coming. Every protostar dreams of this moment. It is the moment when the force of gravity, which has spent eons trying to crush the star, is finally met by an equal and opposite force. The temperature in Lumen's heart reached 15 million degrees Celsius. In that instant, the hydrogen nuclei, squeezed together under the colossal weight of all the gathered gas, finally slammed into each other with such force that they fused. They stopped being separate hydrogen atoms and became a single atom of helium. This was the great secret of the cosmos. When hydrogen fuses into helium, it releases an unimaginable burst of light and energy. F-Woom. It wasn't a roar. It was a silent, magnificent ignition. The outward pressure of the light and heat from this new fusion furnace finally held the crushing weight of gravity at bay. Lumen stopped contracting. She had achieved balance. She was a star. Lumen pushed her outer layers of gas away, and for the first time, she shone. She was a brilliant, newborn, golden yellow dwarf star, perfectly settled and perfectly content, ready to burn steadily for the next 10 billion years. She had awakened in the vast darkness, and her light had chased away the deep indigo shadows of the great nebula of Somnus. The age of Lumen had begun. Lumen settled into her new, brilliant existence, finding a profound and lasting peace. The terrible, crushing pressure of her birth was gone, replaced by a perfect, sustained balance. For every atom of hydrogen desperately pulled inward by gravity, there was an outward rush of light and heat, powered by the incredible fusion reaction at her heart. She was now a main sequence star, a golden yellow dwarf, and this was her golden age, a period of quiet, immense stability that would last for 10 billion years. Imagine the longest, most restful sleep you could ever have. That was Lumen's life. Day after cosmic day, year after cosmic year, she performed her single, magnificent duty to convert her own being, hydrogen, into light and warmth. She was an eternal, gentle furnace, never flickering, never wavering, sending her golden rays out into the darkness. But Lumen was not alone. She had her vast, flat protoplanetary disk, the dusty, gaseous nursery that still spun around her equator. In this swirling cosmic pancake, the small, leftover bits of matter that hadn't been pulled into Lumen herself began their own slow dance. It is time to build, the universe seemed to whisper to the disk. The microscopic grains of rock and ice, heated by Lumen's new light, started to bump into each other. Most collisions were gentle, resulting in a simple stick. Over millions of years, these tiny particles grew into pebbles. The pebbles grew into rocks. The rocks grew into kilometer-wide objects called planetesimals. It was a slow, majestic, and sometimes violent process. The planetesimals, guided by their own small gravity and Lumen's immense pull, crashed together, merging and shattering, until a few large, lucky survivors emerged. First came the giants, far from Lumen's searing heat, where ices could survive. Vast cores of rock and frozen water formed. Their strong gravity then captured the remaining light gases, hydrogen and helium, from the disk. These huge, colorful worlds, swirled with stripes and clouds, became Lumen's protectors, her outer court. cold, beautiful, and utterly massive. Closer in, where the heat was too intense for ice to condense, only solid rock and metals survived. Here, smaller, harder worlds were forged. They were Lumen's favored children, rocky, fiery, and eventually, one of them found the perfect distance. It was not too hot, not too cold. It settled into the habitable zone. On this special third world, Lumen's light was a blessing. It bathed the surface in warmth, melted the ice that had survived the early, tumultuous period, and created vast, shimmering oceans. Lumen's light didn't just illuminate the planet. It provided the energy for the very first tentative sparks of life to appear in the warm, primordial seas. Lumen shone on. She knew her purpose now. She was the giver of energy, the stable anchor for an entire family of worlds, the source of life-giving warmth for the tiny, fragile things that began to crawl out of the oceans on her third, blue child. For 4.5 billion years, Lumen's life was an endless, perfect repetition of fusion and light. She was the definition of reliability. But even a star's life is finite. Deep within her core, a slow, inevitable change was occurring. Lumen had been turning hydrogen into helium for a very, very long time. Helium, the byproduct of fusion, was inert. It was building up like ash in her center. This helium ash didn't burn, and as the usable hydrogen fuel around the helium core began to dwindle, the core itself, no longer supported by the full, steady pressure of fusion, began to shrink again. Gravity was returning, stronger now, to remind Lumen that even golden ages must end. This slight shrinkage caused the temperature in the layers surrounding the core to rise drastically. The remaining hydrogen, which had been too cool to fuse before, now ignited in a ferocious shell around the dead helium core. This new, faster, hotter burning was unstable. Lumen's surface began to tremble. The newfound ferocity of the shell-burning fusion generated so much outward pressure that it overwhelmed the star's gravity. Lumen began to expand. She swelled, slowly at first, but then faster and faster, her outer layers cooling as they stretched outward into the vast, lonely void. Her beautiful, golden yellow color started to fade, replaced by a deep, ominous red. The clock was ticking. The next, final chapter of Lumen's life was about to begin. She was transforming from a gentle, nourishing sun into a massive, brooding red giant. The swelling began subtly, a slight blush in Lumen's outer atmosphere, but soon it became an unstoppable, vast expansion. The gentle, golden stability of her main sequence life was over, replaced by a brooding, terrifying enormity. Lumen was losing her beautiful golden color, cooling as she stretched, transforming into a deep, pulsing red giant. Her size became monstrous. Once, she had been a small, brilliant sphere, a pinpoint of light to her nearest orbiting children. Now, her surface was racing outwards, a silent, slow-motion tidal wave of plasma and gas. Lumen was a giver of life, but this new phase was one of immense destruction. She first encountered her innermost child, the small, fiery planet of rock and metal closest to her core. It was the planet that had never quite cooled down, a world of volcanoes and molten stone. The planet tried to resist, but Lumen's enormous, diffused atmosphere enveloped it completely. It didn't crash, it was simply submerged, the incredible heat vaporizing its surface, and the friction slowing its orbit until it spiraled silently into the expanding depths of the star. Then came the second world, a rocky planet slightly larger than the first. Its fate was the same, a slow, agonizing dissolution into the star's vast, new atmosphere. Lumen expanded until her surface was close to the orbit of her third child, the precious blue planet, the world that carried the gentle, nascent stirrings of life in its oceans and on its continents. She burned red, but her inner consciousness, the memory of her long life, was filled with a painful awareness of what she was doing. She didn't want to consume the blue planet, but the laws of stellar physics were absolute. The outer edge of her atmosphere, now 100 times larger than before, kissed the planet's atmosphere, boiling the oceans into steam that vanished into space, and scorching the land until all life ceased. The planet survived the immediate ingestion, pushed back by Lumen's powerful outer winds, but it was now a dry, lifeless cinder, orbiting a terrifying, colossal red sun. Meanwhile, a second, more powerful change was occurring deep within Lumen's enormous, contracting core. The helium ash, which had been inert, was now squeezed by gravity to an impossible density. The temperature, driven by the pressure of the star's immense outer layers, soared past 100 million degrees Celsius. Finally, the temperature became high enough, with a sudden, explosive ignition known as the helium flash. The helium in Lumen's core began to fuse, not into a roaring fire, but into a new, complex element, carbon. This was Lumen's final, greatest gift. All the elements vital for future life, the carbon that forms the basis of all life forms, the oxygen for breathing, and the nitrogen, were being forged in her superheated, compressed center. She was no longer just a hydrogen furnace. She was a vast, cosmic alchemy laboratory. This new helium burning stabilized Lumen temporarily. She shrank slightly, becoming hotter and more compact than she was during her full red giant phase, settling into the final stage of her stellar life. She now had two furnaces, a helium-burning core, creating carbon, and a hydrogen-burning shell, creating helium. But this phase, where the delicate, precious elements were being forged, would not last long. Helium is a much heavier, faster-burning fuel than hydrogen. The inevitable end was approaching with gathering speed. Lumen knew her time as a stable entity was drawing to a close. She looked out at her remaining children, the gas giants, now warm and comfortable further out in their orbits, and prepared for her last, magnificent act of cosmic generosity. The intense, beautiful, but short-lived helium burning stage was coming to its close. The inner furnaces of Lumen had created all the carbon and oxygen they possibly could, leaving behind a dense, ultra-hot core of these heavy elements, a stellar diamond in the making. Now, with both the central helium fire and the outer hydrogen shell burning inconsistently, Lumen became desperately unstable. She started to tremble and pulse. Her structure began to swell and shrink violently, like a great cosmic heart struggling to take one last breath. These thermal pulses were powerful, catastrophic events. With each pulse, the outer, expanded atmosphere of Lumen, the very gas that had once been the serene, golden shield of her younger days, was hit by immense bursts of energy. The star knew it was time to let go. With a final, gentle sigh, Lumen began her majestic farewell. She pushed. She began to shed her outer layers of gas and dust into the surrounding space. It was not an explosion like a supernova, but a quiet, powerful exhalation, stretching out over tens of thousands of years. The expelled material did not just dissipate. It expanded outward, carrying with it the precious, newly forged elements, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. These were the seeds of future life, the raw materials that would one day build new planets, new stars, and perhaps new living things. Lumen was recycling herself, giving her being back to the universe. As the dense cloud moved away from the star's central core, it was illuminated by the fierce, ultraviolet light of the white-hot nucleus Lumen was leaving behind. The result was the creation of a planetary nebula. Imagine a painter's masterpiece suddenly coming to life. The nebula wasn't a solid cloud. It was a vast, shimmering bubble, sometimes perfectly spherical, sometimes shaped like a pair of wings, a brilliant, glowing jewel against the dark velvet of space. It was a kaleidoscope of color, vibrant greens from the oxygen, brilliant reds from the nitrogen, and soft pinks from the hydrogen, all illuminated by the naked, fierce light of the core. It was the most beautiful thing Lumen had ever created. It was her final, perfect gift to the universe, a silent testament to a long life of quiet duty. As the layers drifted further and further away, revealing more and more of the center, the core of Lumen stood exposed. It was tiny now, barely the size of her long-lost blue planet, yet impossibly dense and blindingly hot. This was the final form of her heart, a white dwarf. It had no fusion, its fires were truly, finally extinguished. It was held up, not by the outward pressure of light, but by a strange, subtle force known as electron degeneracy pressure, a quantum resistance that kept it from collapsing further. It was pure matter, solidified energy, a glowing ember of her former self. The white dwarf was silent, still, and incredibly persistent. It would continue to shine for billions of years, not because it was burning fuel, but because it was slowly, steadily radiating away the immense heat trapped inside its carbon and oxygen structure. The light of the white dwarf was a cool, pale, blue-white glow, a soft, ethereal lamp left burning in the darkness. It was the peaceful memory of Lumen, watching over the fading magnificence of the planetary nebula that would eventually dissolve back into the interstellar medium. The story of the star was over, but the story of the elements she released was just beginning. The beautiful, glowing shell of Lumen's planetary nebula continued to expand outward, growing thinner and dimmer as it spread. It was a temporary masterpiece, a cosmic dream that lasted only a few short tens of thousands of years before its gases became too dispersed to be seen. Finally, the elements forged in Lumen's dying heart, the carbon for structure, the oxygen for breath, the nitrogen for growth, mixed completely with the cold, dark, interstellar medium. The atoms, now free, began their long, quiet journey across the galaxy, drifting and waiting for their next great role. Lumen, the white dwarf, remained at the center. She was the ghost of a star, a tiny, glowing ember in the place where a giant had once lived. She was perfectly stable, but her fire was gone. Her only power was her trapped heat, which she continued to radiate, cooling with agonizing slowness. It would take trillions of years, time so immense it dwarfs the entire age of the universe so far, for the white dwarf to truly fade. Slowly, inevitably, the blue-white light would dim to pale yellow, then to red, then to a deep, invisible infrared glow. Eventually, when the last molecule of heat has escaped, Lumen will become a black dwarf, a cold, non-radiating, silent diamond of carbon and oxygen, forever adrift in the universal darkness. But this is a story for an end we may never see. The true ending of Lumen's story lies not in her cold core, but in the atoms she released. Imagine, eons later, those wandering atoms of carbon and oxygen bump into a new, giant molecular cloud, a new nebula of Somnus. Gravity, the grand conductor, begins to hum its song again. This time, the new cloud is richer, denser, and darker, because it contains the precious remnants of stars like Lumen. The gas and dust collapse, and a new generation of stars begins to ignite. Around those new, young stars, a new planetary disk begins to form. And what are those new planets made of? They are built from the recycled parts of Lumen. One day, on a vibrant new world orbiting a new yellow dwarf star, those very atoms form the core of a towering tree, the shimmer of a clear lake, or the beating heart of a small, sleeping creature. When you look up at the night sky and see the brilliant tapestry of stars, remember Lumen. Remember that the elements in your own body, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the carbon that makes you you, were all forged inside the heart of a star that lived and died long ago. woman's light may have faded, but her essence is now everywhere. She is in the dust of the next generation of stars. She is in the planets that circle them, and she is in the breath you take right now. The universe does not truly end anything, it simply transforms. Every light must fade, but every fading light is a promise of a new, brighter beginning. Sleep well, knowing that you too are made of stardust.